Hey, it's Yay for Yarn, and today I'm going to show you how to seamlessly graft crochet. So this technique is perfect for any place where you want to connect the foundation chain edge to the top edge of your work, but you don't want a seam. And even if your project calls for a seam, I think this could be potentially a good thing to switch to instead of using the seam, because this leaves a completely seamless, you will never be able to tell where you connected the bottom foundation chain to the top of the work. Now this can also be useful if you have like a really big mistake in a couple rows of your crochet and you want to rip out those couple rows, but you've already crocheted pretty far past them and you don't want to rip out the entire project. So in that case, you could just kind of, mark, okay, this is the set of rows that I want to remove. And then you could just take like your scissors or whatever and clip out, from maybe the turning chain of the first row you want to take out up into the last stitch of the last row you want to take out, and then unravel the section that has the mistake in it, and then you can go back and fix that by filling that back in, seamlessly grafting in a new section with no mistakes. So this is the same technique and the same stitch pattern even that I'm going to show you right now that I've used in my Boundless cowl, which is also seamlessly grafted, but I'm using the same stitch pattern here, and I'm going to show you how to do it in a thicker yarn with two different colors so you can kind of see the contrast better, and that way it might be a little bit easier and clearer if it's harder to see in the cowl video. So basically what we're going to do is we're going to start with a provisional foundation chain, and that basically means we're doing a separate foundation chain that can be removed. So I've got two different colors of yarn. I'm going to work my main section in this color and do the grafting part in this color. So the first thing we need is our provisional foundation chain. So we're going to take an extra piece of yarn, our waste yarn, and we're going to chain however many stitches that the pattern calls for. Like so. And then we're going to tie off. If you want to even chain a couple extra, that's okay. So I'm going to cut this yarn. This is my waste yarn. If you were using a real piece of waste yarn, then don't worry about cutting it because it'll already be cut. But if you look closely at the chain stitch, you can see the one side of the chain has these little V-shaped, interlocking V-shaped sections. But if you turn it over, the back side has these vertical bumps that go down the center. And if you turn it sideways a little bit, you can kind of see them, that they're little bumps that go along the back of the chain. So this is the front of the chain, and this is the back. We're going to be working into the back of the chain, into these vertical bump strands of yarn. Not the ones on the sides that kind of curve around, but the ones that go straight up the middle. And if we do that, if we work all of our stitches into the back of the chain, into those vertical bump strands, then we will be able to unravel this waste yarn foundation chain without having to, pull it out of all the different stitches and just, really slowly pull out every strand, because we'll just be able to unravel it as if we unraveled a regular piece of crochet. And it won't unravel on its own because we tied it off. So all we'll have to do is just undo that little tie off right there and pull this tail out, and then we can just unravel it very quickly and easily. And that's what we need, because we're going to be unraveling that foundation chain when we graft the two sides together. So now the next step is to begin working your project. So I'm going to take my main color yarn here, And I'm going to, if your project calls for a turning chain at the beginning of the row, then you can go ahead and do that. But what I will tell you I would recommend is when you do that, just insert your hook into one of the first vertical bumps of the chain on the back of the chain and just pull up a loop and do your chain from there. But I'm going to start with a chainless starting double crochet. And again, if you don't want to do a chainless starting stitch, or if the pattern calls for something else, go ahead and use the turning chain. That is perfectly fine. It will still work with the technique. So I'm going to start my first row with a slip knot on my hook, and I'm going to work a double crochet into the back of the foundation chain. And then on the cowl pattern, it does tell you exactly which stitches to work in, and whatever pattern you're using will tell you, how to work into your foundation chain. Or if your pattern has like a foundation row where you do so many chains and then you work maybe a row of single crochet first, skip the row of single crochet and just work your first row of the stitch pattern into this provisional foundation chain. And if it's a multiple row stitch pattern where the pattern is formed over more than one row of crochet, then don't worry about that, as long as all of the stitches are either worked into a chain space or into a regular stitch. So what I mean by that is basically you can do anything that does not involve working into the front loop only or the back loop only. It is possible to graft in the front loop only or the back loop only. It's just a different technique from what I'm showing here. So that can be in a future video. But for this technique, it will work with any kind of project or stitch pattern that does not involve working in the back loop only or the front loop only. Alright, so I've worked the first row of my stitch pattern, and as you can see, the crochet is going to have more stretch in it than this provisional foundation chain, which is okay because foundation chains generally don't have as much stretch as the rest of the work. So by using a provisional foundation chain and grafting the ends together, then we're going to eliminate that foundation chain that's going to inhibit the stretch. And this technique is really ideal for things like infinity scarves and cowls and anything, again, where you have to graft the bottom edge of the work to the top. So I'm going to continue working some more length in my stitch pattern here so that it's long enough to join to the foundation chain or the provisional foundation chain, and then I'll show you how to graft it. Alright, so here's my finished sample, and basically what I've done is I've just kept crocheting my stitch pattern until, if this was a real project, until it would be the correct length for the project, the correct number of rows. And I'm going to bring the top edge of the work around like this, and the foundation chain edge down like so. And we're going to kind of pretend here that this was an infinity scarf, because that would probably be the most common use for this technique, besides fixing mistakes. So basically all you need to do here is make sure that when you look at your foundation chain row, the row that is the first row right here, this row has the wrong side facing me. So the row that I just finished also has the wrong side facing me. So we could, but we don't normally have two wrong side rows when we're working back and forth right on top of each other. That would be a little more conspicuous, because normally we have a wrong side row and then a right side row and then another wrong side row and another right side row. So we're going to create a right side row so that the right side of the work is facing me, and we're going to use it to join these two ends together. So first of all, I made a little bit of a mistake with my provisional foundation chain and started working into it from the wrong end. So if I were to unravel this, it would start unraveling from this end. And although we're going to finish the row that we are joining with at this end, we need the beginning of the grafting row to start on the end that is where we finished our provisional foundation chain and not at the beginning. I can't help that now because it's already done, but that I guess will also give me an opportunity to show you how to fix that or how to compensate for that if you have made that same mistake. And it's a pretty easy one to make. So what we're going to do is work our little joining row or our grafting row across the work. And you will need to adapt the technique to whatever stitch pattern you're working into. If you're just doing like back and forth double crochet and that's your only stitch, then you won't need to worry about the technique for working, where you have multiple stitches into one chain space, because you won't have that in your work. So I'm going to show you how to do it, whether the stitches are worked into a chain space or whether they're worked into regular stitches. And you will be able to adapt, both of those methods to whatever stitch pattern you're working in. So for clarity's sake, so that you can see it on the camera, I'm going to do this in a contrasting yarn. So as I was mentioning before, I have ended with a wrong side row, and the first row, the beginning row right here, is also a wrong side row in the sense that the wrong side is facing me. I could also flip this around and have the right side facing me on both sides, but it doesn't necessarily matter. So what we need to do is end with a right side row to join these together. We need that right side row to go in between these two wrong side rows. And I'm going to be doing this with my contrasting yarn. However, if you are, and you normally will be, if you are working with the same color yarn that you've been using throughout, then you will just need to keep working with the yarn that you are using for your project. So what you're going to need to do is you want to, normally if you're using the working yarn, the same color that you're using for the rest of your project, to graft the ends together, you're going to work the next row, which would be that right side row, and then cut the yarn and unravel that row. Now it doesn't matter if you are doing a pattern with a multiple row repeat, but you just need to make sure that whatever row that you are beginning with, you want to make sure that you are going to end with the row that would normally go beneath this row for your stitch pattern. So what you would do is you would work whatever the next row is that's supposed to go below this row. You're going to work it across, cut the yarn, and then unravel it. And that ensures, first of all, that you have enough yarn to make it across with the grafting. The grafting doesn't take any extra yarn, but you want to make sure that you have enough to get across your row, because every stitch pattern takes a different amount of yarn for one row. And number two, you have to have a cut end of the yarn to make this technique possible. You cannot graft anything while the working yarn that you're grafting with is still attached to the skein. It has to be cut and separate from the skein. So I have my contrast yarn here, and what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of unfold this for a second. I'm going to pull through with my new yarn on this last stitch of the previous row as if this were my working yarn. So I'm just going to pretend that this turquoise here is the same yarn that I was using for the rest of the swatch. And I'm just going to tie these together just to hold it for now. So what I'm going to do is work the next row in my repeat. This is only a one row repeat, but again, you need to do whatever works for your stitch pattern, whichever row is correct for not only what comes next after the row you just did, but what comes before the beginning row. So now that I have my contrast yarn here joined, I'm going to go ahead and work the row that is going to go in between here normally, and then I'm going to cut the yarn before we do the grafting part. Alright, so here's the end of my row. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and leave a pretty decent amount of tail just in case your tension is just slightly different between the test row, so to speak, and the real grafting row. And then I'm going to go ahead and unravel that row back to where I started. Now, I'm going to show you how to do this both ways, but normally when you work a row, you're going to start with a turning chain. Now, on my swatch, I've been using a chainless starting double crochet, so I'm going to show you how to do both. Start your grafting row with a turning chain or a chainless starting stitch. Basically, what we're going to be doing is pulling the top loop of every stitch that would have stitches worked into it from up here through the bottom of one of these stitches. So what I'm going to do first is I'm going to show you how to start if you were doing a turning chain. So for a double crochet, which is what my row would start with, I would chain 3. But that top chain we need to use to pull through the bottom of this first stitch up here, because normally in my stitch pattern, this first double crochet of the row, or it's kind of the last because we worked it across this direction, but the edge double crochet is worked into the turning chain or chainless starting stitch. So I'm going to unravel the top chain out of those 3. I'm going to stretch my loop a little bit and let go of it. And what we're going to do is kind of pick apart the chain stitch that is holding the bottom of this double crochet over here. Now, again, if I had started working into my provisional foundation chain from the correct end, then I would be able to just pick out the knot and just, unravel the chain as I went across the way you would normally unravel a chain. But you can still do it even if you had it at the wrong end. So basically what happens is when you pull the stitch, looser, you have kind of a loop before your tail. So I'm just going to follow that tail yarn and pull it out until I just have the double crochet sitting on the, it's crocheted over the yarn basically. That's all it is. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of turn this sideways or upside down so I can get at it a little easier. As you can see, this double crochet has 2 strands of yarn that go around my waste yarn here, my provisional waste yarn. And what I'm going to do is insert my hook into both of those. You just want to follow the same path that waste yarn is going through. So now you can see what it looks like on both sides. And then I'm going to take my loop on the hook, tighten it back down so that it's the correct size for a normal chain stitch, and pull it through. Now, there is a difference between when a stitch is worked into a chain stitch and when stitches are worked into a chain space. A chain space is what we have right here, which is a little gap that the stitches on the next row are worked into the gap and not into the specific chain stitch. So what we're doing right here is having this double crochet worked into a chain stitch and not the chain space. We're not working into a gap, we're working into this chain stitch. So I will show you how to do the chain space version in just a minute. But what we're going to do is, now that we have pulled the loop through the bottom of that stitch, we're going to finish the chain like so and tighten it down just a little bit. So now you can see that double crochet is now worked into the top of that chain 3 turning chain. So this loop that's on my hook right now is going to be the top loop of our next stitch. So what we're going to do is let go of it again. Because this is the top loop and we're always working with that top loop, I'm going to stretch it out and let go. And then I'm going to go ahead and pull the waste yarn out of the stitch that I already grafted. And then I'm going to go ahead and pick out the chain stitch from the next stitch. And this is another double crochet. Now, normally in my stitch pattern, this double crochet would be worked into this next double crochet right here. So if you look at some of these other rows up here, there are 2 double crochets at the edge of the work. So I'm going to again insert my crochet hook across through the bottom of that stitch from the row above, like so. And again, we're doing this in the opposite direction we crochet. If you are right-handed like me, you're going to insert your hook from left to right. If you are left-handed, you're going to be inserting your hook from right to left. You're going to be inserting into the stitches from the row above in the opposite direction that you normally crochet. So I have this inserted, quote, backwards or in the opposite direction than I would normally crochet. And I'm going to move the waste yarn out of the way. I'm going to take my loop that I had stretched out and let go of, tighten it back down, and pull it through the bottom of that double crochet. And then I'm going to pull it a little tight because we do have that extra stitch already, sitting on that loop. And we don't want the top loop to be too loose. But now that we have that loop and it is going through the bottom of that stitch above, we can work a regular double crochet into the next stitch that we're supposed to work into for this row down here. So I now have 2 stitches. I'm going to go ahead and pull the waste yarn out of that stitch I just did. But we now have 2 stitches that are grafted like so. So what happens next in this stitch pattern is we would normally skip the next 2 double crochet and work into this chain space right here, this little gap. So to have stitches worked into a chain space, there's a different method than just what we did over here, worked into a chain stitch, where we just pulled the loop through and then worked our chain stitch. So basically what we're always going to be doing is pulling that top loop through this stitch from the foundation row first, and then working the regular stitch. So what would normally happen is I would work 2 double crochets, chain 1 for the chain space, and then work 2 more double crochets, all in this chain space. So because the 2 double crochets do not get worked into, I'm not going to graft any stitches into those 2 double crochets. So I'm going to work 2 double crochets into my chain space, like so. And then normally we would work the chain 1 next, and that would be our chain space. I just unraveled that though, because we're going to graft that together with the stitches that are up here. Now, I have a couple of empty, at least one empty chain from my provisional waste yarn foundation chain, because we skip. In my stitch pattern, we're skipping 2 stitches before we work into the chain space. So I'm going to take all these stitches right here, there's 4 double crochets, are all going to have to go into this chain space that I'm about to make down here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to work that chain 1 stitch, stretch the loop out on the hook and let go of it. Then I'm going to come up here and make sure that all those stitches are sitting on the waste yarn, and we kind of open it up like this so that you can see them individually. And then I'm going to, again, from the opposite direction I crochet in, if this was right side up, then I would be going this direction. So I'm going to insert into not just the first stitch, but through all the stitches that are going to go into that chain space in order in the opposite direction that I crochet. So I'm going to insert into the first one and the second one, then the third one, and the fourth one. And again, we're just following the path that that waste yarn is taking through the bottom of those 4 stitches. So now I'm going to turn it back this way, and as you can see, we already worked the chain stitch. That is going to be our chain space that these stitches up here will go into. So what we're going to do is, if we were to just take the top loop and pull it through, all of these stitches would end up in the top of the next double crochet, and that's not where they go. So to have some stitches worked into a chain space, whether it be one or several, we not only have to pull the loop through, but we have to pull all of the length of our yarn. Remember, we cut the yarn. This is why we cut the yarn. Now, if you're working a stitch pattern that requires just a plain row of double crochet, half double crochet, whatever, just a plain row of stitches that are all, you know, all the stitches from the row above are worked into regular stitches, then you don't absolutely have to cut the yarn. But when you're doing anything where some stitches are worked into a chain space, you will need to cut the yarn. And that's why we worked across and then unraveled it. So what we're going to do is take not just the loop that we stretched out, we're going to put that back on the hook, but we're also going to take the yarn with it. So I'm going to take the yarn and wrap it around the hook as well and pull both that loop and the working yarn through the bottom of those 4 stitches. And then when it comes out the other side, we'll be able to pull on each one and tell which one is the working yarn. And then we're going to pull on that until it completely comes out all the way to the end. So here's the loop, and the working yarn is still coming out this side. So we now have those 4 double crochets all sandwiched onto that chain space. Now again, my next 2 stitches are not worked into from up here. These stitches up here are not going to go into the next 2 double crochet that go into this space. So I'm going to work my next 2 double crochet into this space from the row below. And the next step in my stitch pattern, we would skip these 2 double crochet right here and put a double crochet in each of these 2. So I kind of have columns of shells and then columns of pairs of double crochet. So these 2 double crochet right here are going to go into these 2 double crochet right here. I have a column of double crochets. So now I'm going to take my top loop and stretch it out and let go of it. I have to pull the remaining waste yarn that was holding this set of stitches right here. I pull that out and then just unpick however many chains it takes to get to the next stitch. If you're working into every single stitch, then there will be a stitch in every single chain of your foundation chain. But my stitch pattern requires skipping some stitches, so that's why I have extra stitches in my foundation chain in between. So again, I'm going to come up here and insert my hook into the bottom, through the bottom of the next stitch from this row above. Again, in the opposite direction from where you crochet. I'm going to put the loop back on the hook and pull it through the base of that stitch. And then I can work my regular double crochet down here into the row below. So I now have this double crochet up here grafted into the top of this double crochet here, which is worked into the top of this double crochet here. So this is the column of double crochet that I would normally have lined up in my stitch pattern. So now I can go ahead and pull the remaining waste yarn length out of that stitch because it's already grafted. And you can see as we're moving along here that if this were the same color, you would not be able to see any of this grafting row. It would be totally invisible and blend right in. Now before I finish this row, I'm going to go ahead and show you how you would graft a chainless starting double crochet. Now this is also possible with a chainless starting half double crochet or a chainless starting treble crochet. A chainless starting single crochet is also going to work as well. But since I worked my turning chain here, the chain 3, I'm going to go ahead and show you over here how you would do this if you were doing a chainless starting double crochet or any chainless starting stitch. So I'm just going to take a little bit extra yarn, and I'm going to pretend this was my edge stitch right here. So I'm going to pull up a loop in that stitch, and let's pretend that this was the edge right here. Let's pretend this stitch right here was this stitch, and I was about to work the chainless starting double crochet to begin the row. So normally when you work a chainless starting double crochet, you stretch the loop on your hook, hold on to it with your finger, wrap the hook kind of around that strand of yarn, and then yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two. And that's what creates our chainless starting double crochet. But we need to get that top loop through the stitch up here that it's supposed to go into. So what we're going to do is, because the loop is stretched out already, I'm going to come up here. I'm not going to unpick the chain because this is just a temporary demonstration, but normally you would unpick the chain that's holding the stitch that would go in the top, which would be your edge stitch from the row above. I'm going to grab this loop and pull it through. And again, because this is a chainless starting double crochet, we're not going to tighten that loop back down because we're going to use it. We're going to hold on to the loop that's at the top, wrap the hook around those double strands at the bottom, and insert into the stitch below. Yarn over, pull up a loop, yarn over, pull through two, yarn over, pull through two, just like a regular double crochet. So if you're using the chainless starting double crochet or half double or treble or whatever, that would be how you would work that into the edge stitch to begin your new row, or your new round for that matter. And that will also be completely seamless and invisible. So I'm going to go ahead and unravel that because that was just to show you how to do that for the chainless starting version. And I'm going to keep going across my row as I was doing already. So the next stitch will be the second double crochet in my pair right here. I have two double crochets before the next shell. So the stitch pattern, we always work into these two double crochets. So again, anytime you have a finished stitch right below your hook, the loop on your hook will become the top loop of the next stitch. So I'm going to stretch it out, let go of it, and then pick out the next chain in my provisional foundation chain and insert my hook in the opposite direction from what I crochet through the base of that stitch, grab the loop and pull it through that stitch. So again, we pull the top loop through first, then we work the stitch into the row below. So we always connect with the row above before we work into the row below, and pull that extra waste yarn out. So again, the next step in my stitch pattern is to work this little shell here, which is my 2 double crochet, chain 1, 2 double crochet, all into this chain space. So I'm skipping the first 2 from the row below and working into that chain space. So likewise, because every row in my stitch is the same, these stitches up here, which is my previous shell from the foundation edge, that needs to be worked into the chain space I'm about to make. So again, I'm going to work the first 2 double crochet because they do not have any stitches worked into them from the row above. Then, because this is a chain space, I'm going to chain 1, stretch the loop out, and let go of it. If you had a chain space that was more than one chain, you know, if it said chain 3, then you would have a chain 3 chain space. But the technique still is the same. So now I'm going to pick out the chain stitch from the next stitches, and again I have a couple in between here that are skipped because my stitch pattern has skipped stitches in it. So we now have these 4 double crochets up here that will need to be worked into this chain space. So again, I'm going to insert it in the opposite direction. I crochet through the entire set of stitches and not just one at a time. So if you were working into grafting into several stitches at once that all need to go into the same chain space or into the same stitch for that matter. If all of these had to go into one stitch, regular stitch, then we would just pull the top loop through before working the regular stitch. But because this is a chain space, again, I'm going to grab the loop on the hook, or that was on the hook a minute ago, and grab the working yarn and pull both through all 4 of those stitches, and then pull on the working yarn that's around my hook until the end of it comes out, like so. So now all those stitches go into that chain space, and I can work the next 2 double crochets of my shell, like so. And then of course we need to pull the waste yarn out of that set of stitches we just grafted. Alright, so now I have the next step in my stitch pattern, which is again these 2 double crochets. So as for any regular stitch, we're just going to pick out the chain from the stitch above that's going to be grafted in, and stretch the loop on the hook and let go of it, and then insert the hook into the bottom of that stitch above in the opposite direction from what we crochet, and grab that loop and pull it through. And then we can go ahead and tighten it up and work the regular stitch into the row below. So again, I'm going to stretch the loop on the hook and let go of it. I'm going to go ahead and pull the waste yarn out of the stitch we just grafted and pick out the next chain stitch, and then go ahead and insert my hook from the opposite direction we crochet through the bottom of the next stitch, grab that loop and pull it through. Then we can again tighten that loop and work into the next stitch in the row below. So for the first part of my shell, I need to work those 2 double crochet into the chain space from the row below, and then the chain space that these stitches will go in will be right here. We're going to chain 1, stretch the loop, and let go. And then again, I've already picked out the chain stitches that held these 4 double crochets. I'm going to go ahead and insert in the opposite direction I crochet into all of those stitches as a group or set of stitches. We're not going to insert first into this one, then this one, then this one, then this one. We're going through all of them in the same direction. And then we'll grab that loop. And again, because this is a chain space, we need to grab the working yarn and pull it through with the loop. And then we can go ahead and figure out which one's the working yarn and pull on it until the end comes out. And that's our chain space. So I can now work the next 2 double crochet of my shell into the previous row in that same chain space and pull the provisional waste yarn out of the base of that shell. Then all I've got left is these 2 double crochet at the end in both my row above and the row below. So I'm going to go ahead and unpick the chain up to the next double crochet that I have to graft. And then I can go ahead and stretch the loop on my hook, let go of it, and insert my hook into that stitch in the opposite direction I crochet into the bottom of that stitch, the same path that the waste yarn is going through, and grab the loop, tighten it down a bit, and pull it through the base of that stitch. Then I can work the actual stitch in my grafting row into the row below. One more time, just stretch the loop on the hook, pull the waste yarn out of the previously grafted stitch, and then I just have this last, since this is my last stitch, I just have one, not even a chain, it's just sitting on the waste yarn, and I can insert my hook in the opposite direction I crochet into the base of that stitch, grab the loop, tighten it down, and pull it through. And then I can work the regular and final stitch into my row below. So now I can go ahead and tie off like so and pull the waste yarn completely out of that last stitch. And there you have it. These rows of crochet are completely invisibly grafted. And if my grafting row yarn was the same color, you would never be able to see where you grafted the ends of this piece together. So normally if all of the rows were the same color as you would normally have in a project, then we would just weave in these tails and nobody would ever know where the end of the piece was because we seamlessly grafted those pieces together. So I would recommend, if you're going to try this for the first time, I would recommend doing a swatch like I've done here. I would even recommend trying with this stitch pattern first. You can get the complete instructions for the stitch pattern in the infinity scarf pattern that goes with this video. It's the same stitch and we're going to use the same grafting method to join the ends together. So I would recommend trying it in this swatch first and working your grafting row in a contrast color, and then you can go ahead and try it in whatever stitch pattern that you like. Even if you just go grab one out of your favorite stitch dictionary and work up a little swatch just to kind of test it, play with it, and get the hang of it and make sure that you understand it and it makes sense so that when you go to do it in a real project, then it'll click better and you'll be able to apply these concepts to whatever stitch pattern your design is using. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you liked it, please give it a thumbs up. Let me know what kind of project you would use grafting in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe, making sure you click the little bell next to the subscribe button to be notified of new videos. Thanks for watching.